I was a young woman who had just moved to a new city. After graduating, I decided to start fresh in this unfamiliar place. Fortunately, I quickly found a job and rented a small, affordable apartment. The landlord was an elderly man living alone, probably in his 60s. When we first met, he seemed friendly and helpful, even offering to help me move my things into the apartment. He gave me his phone number and said that if I needed anything, I could call him anytime. He was a bit too eager, but I thought it was just his personality, so I didn't think much of it. A few days after moving in, I started noticing some strange things. Late at night, I would hear faint footsteps outside my door. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor coming home, but the footsteps always stopped right in front of my door, lingered for a few minutes, and then slowly faded away. Sometimes I would smell a strange odor, like a mix of cleaning products and mold, coming through the door crack. I told myself it was just a new place, probably a faulty drainage system, or the neighbors cleaning something. To ease my anxiety, I decided to install a security camera outside my door. The next morning, as I was getting ready to leave, I noticed the camera was gone. It had been mounted on the wall outside my door, but now there were only a few cut wires left. Feeling uneasy, I called the landlord to ask if he knew anything about it. To my surprise, his tone was very calm, even a bit vague, suggesting that maybe the wind blew it off. I knew that was impossible. There hadn't been any wind that night, and even if there was, the camera couldn't just vanish into thin air. Things began to get weirder. One night, I was jolted awake by a faint tapping sound. I lay in bed, listening to the gentle turning of the door handle, my heart pounding in my chest. I quietly got out of bed and crept to the door, peeking through the peephole. No one was there, but I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, as if someone's eyes were staring right through the door. At that moment, I almost stopped breathing. Over the next few nights, the tapping and footsteps became more frequent, and the sounds would last longer. I began to feel afraid and decided to change the locks on my door. However, somehow, my keys suddenly disappeared. I clearly remembered putting them on the table, but they were just gone. I began to suspect that the landlord might have taken them, but I also thought that idea was too crazy. I told myself I might just be stressed from work and imagining things. Finally, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard the door handle turn again. This time, the sound was louder and lasted longer. I stood by the door, gripping my phone, ready to call the police. Just then, I heard a low voice outside the door. "I know you're in there." It was the landlord's voice. I felt like I might collapse from fear, but I tried to stay calm, standing there silently, not moving an inch. After a few minutes, the voice outside finally faded away. I immediately texted a friend for help, and she suggested I leave immediately. I started packing my things, planning to move out first thing in the morning. However, as I was packing, I heard the sound of the lock being tampered with. A wave of terror washed over me, and I looked through the peephole to see the landlord standing in the hallway, holding a locksmith's toolkit, with a strange smile on his face. I quickly picked up my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. I ran to the bedroom, shut the door, and wedged a chair under the handle, hiding under the bed with my heart racing. My fingers trembled as I repeatedly tried to reconnect the signal, praying for it to come back. Just then, I heard the faint click of the front door unlocking, followed by the slow creak of it opening. The landlord's footsteps dragged heavily across the floor, slowly approaching my hiding place. "I know you're in here," he said again, his voice now even closer, almost whispering in my ear. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Suddenly his phone rang. He seemed to answer it, and after a moment, I heard his footsteps retreating. When I was sure he had left, I crawled out from under the bed, rushed to the window, flung it open, and jumped out. I rolled onto the ground, my body trembling with fear and pain, but I didn't care. I ran straight for the street and finally flagged down a passing cab. I never returned to that apartment again. Later, I heard that the landlord had gone missing, and no one knew where he went. I've tried to forget the terror of that night, but every time midnight comes, I can't help but remember that eerie smile and the whispered words in my ear. "I know you're in there." I am a single mother, living with my 6-year-old son in an old house on the outskirts of town. The house is close to a dense forest, with the nearest neighbors quite a distance away. The area is quiet and isolated, which gave me a sense of safety, even though life as a single parent can be tiring. That is, until one strange night when everything began to change. It was an ordinary evening. I had put my son to bed as usual, and then I sat on the couch in the living room to watch TV. It was already late. The windows outside were pitch black, and the surroundings were eerily quiet. Just after midnight, I suddenly heard a faint knocking sound at the front door. At first, I thought it was just the wind knocking a branch against the door. After all, living in a remote area, you get used to strange noises. But this knocking was different. It was clear and rhythmic, tapping directly on the door. I got up and walked to the door, peering through the peephole, but there was no one there. Feeling uneasy, I turned on the porch light, but the outside was empty, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, and I went back to the couch, trying to focus on the TV. Over the next few days, the knocking sound became more frequent, always happening late at night, sometimes more urgently. At times I could even hear the door handle gently rattling as if someone was trying to turn it. My son started waking up, asking me if someone was at the door. I would reassure him that it was nothing, maybe just branches tapping against the windows. I felt more and more unsettled, so I decided to check the footage from our security camera. The recordings showed a figure appearing in front of our house almost every night, standing still and staring at our door, but disappearing whenever I went to check. The person wore dark clothing with a hood pulled over their face, making it impossible to see any features. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I decided to call the police. The police came by a few times, but they didn't find any suspicious signs. The figure seemed to vanish whenever they patrolled the area. They assured me they would increase patrols around the neighborhood, but suggested it might just be a harmless prank or a homeless person wandering around, and told me not to worry too much. I tried to believe them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. A few days later, I went outside early in the morning to take out the trash, and I noticed the doormat had been moved. I lifted it up and found an old black and white photograph underneath. It was a picture of my house, but it was slightly blurry, with no discernible details. A chill ran down my spine, and I threw the photo into the trash bin, hurried back inside, and locked the door. Then, one evening, as my son and I were in the kitchen preparing dinner, I suddenly heard a faint tapping on his bedroom window, like someone lightly knocking on the glass. I rushed over and saw that the window was slightly ajar. I quickly shut the window, drew the curtains tight, and checked every corner of the house to make sure no one had entered. That night I couldn't sleep at all. I sat up in bed, gripping my phone, listening to every sound around me. Suddenly, I heard a soft noise downstairs. Faint footsteps, moving slowly from the entryway toward the living room. My heart started racing as I carefully crept to the top of the stairs and peeked down. In the dim light, I could see a shadowy figure moving slowly through the living room. They were wearing a black coat with a hood pulled low over their face. I almost screamed, but quickly covered my mouth. I forced myself to stay calm and quietly dialed the emergency number for the police. As I waited for the police to arrive, the figure began moving toward the staircase. I knew I couldn't let them come upstairs. I grabbed a kitchen knife and hid in the shadows at the corner of the stairs. Suddenly, the figure stopped, as if sensing my presence. Their head tilted up slightly, as if searching for me. Just then, I heard the distant sound of police sirens. The figure suddenly turned and bolted toward the door. I heard the front door being flung open and then slammed shut. A few minutes later, the police arrived, but the intruder was already gone. They searched the house and the surrounding woods, but couldn't find any trace of anyone. The police told me they would set up surveillance around the area and increase patrols, advising me not to worry too much. But from that day on, my son and I no longer felt safe staying in the house alone, and we decided to move temporarily to stay with a relative in town. A few days later, I went back to the house to check on it one last time before we officially moved out. I walked into my son's room, staring at the window, recalling the tapping sound from that night. I went over to the window, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The window had been nailed shut from the outside. The nails were new, still shiny. I realized then that the person wasn't just knocking. They had planned to trap us inside. A cold wave of fear washed over me, and I quickly left the house, never to return. Even though we moved to a different place, I still find myself listening in the middle of the night, hearing those knocking sounds in my mind, as if reminding me that somewhere out there, he's still waiting. A few months ago, my good friend Kevin and I decided to go on a cross-country road trip. Growing up in a big city, we rarely had the chance to experience the vast freedom of open roads. This trip had been on our minds for years, a full tank of gas in our SUV, just a few bags of luggage, and no fixed destination. Our goal was to explore those small towns and remote areas that hardly ever made it onto the maps and experience a completely different pace of life. The first few days were perfect. We camped in state parks, had coffee at quaint town cafes, met all sorts of interesting people, and even joined a local festival in a small town. The sense of freedom and adventure was invigorating. Everything seemed great until we stopped at a rundown gas station in a remote little town. It was just before sunset when we were refueling, and as we prepared to leave, a man in his mid-30s approached us. He looked exhausted, wearing a worn-out jacket, and his face was covered in sweat and dirt. He explained that his car had broken down and he needed a ride to the next town. His voice was urgent, almost pleading. Kevin and I exchanged glances, a flicker of unease passing between us. Something about the situation felt off, but the man looked desperate, like he genuinely needed help. So we decided to give him a ride. Once in the car, he quickly began to chat, trying to be friendly and engaging. He said he was a mechanic, rushing to help a client in the next town with a broken-down vehicle. His story seemed ordinary at first, even a bit boring, but soon his questions began to take a strange turn. He asked us detailed questions about our trip, whether we had shared our itinerary with anyone, and if our families knew exactly where we were. His tone seemed casual, but there was a sharpness in his gaze that felt more like probing than polite conversation. As the conversation continued, Kevin and I both felt increasingly uneasy. I suggested we drop him off at the next gas station, mentioning it was close enough to his destination. The man paused briefly, then gave a slight smile and agreed. But there was something unsettling about his expression. We pulled into the gas station, and the man said he needed to use the restroom. He hurried away, leaving us in the car. Finally, feeling relieved, we prepared to leave when Kevin noticed his phone was missing. Immediately, we realized the man had likely stolen it, and our unease turned into fear. We searched around for the man, but he had already disappeared. Sensing danger, we quickly decided to get back on the road. As we drove away, we noticed a black SUV trailing us. No matter how we changed speed or direction, the vehicle remained at a constant distance, following us closely. Kevin tried various maneuvers, taking detours onto back roads in an attempt to lose the SUV. But no matter how far we went, the black SUV stayed right behind us, like a predator stalking its prey. It became clear that this was no coincidence. As night fell, the road grew darker, the only light coming from our headlights stretching across the pavement. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the car lurched violently. A harsh screech filled the air as we were forced to pull over to the side of the road. One of our tires had blown out. The black SUV slowed down and parked a short distance behind us. Its doors opened, and a few shadowy figures stepped out, holding what looked like tools or equipment. It was hard to see their faces in the dim light of the headlights, but an unmistakable chill ran down my spine. Kevin and I gripped the car handles tightly, our hearts racing. We were terrified, but knew we had to stay calm. Kevin quickly devised a plan. He whispered to me that we needed to make a move while the men were still at a distance. He restarted the engine, and we forced the car forward despite the blown tire, the wheels screeching against the asphalt as we sped down the road. The men seemed caught off guard by our sudden move, but quickly jumped back into their SUV to follow. Kevin pressed the gas pedal to the floor, and despite the damage, we pushed our vehicle as fast as it would go. After several tense minutes of high-speed pursuit, we finally saw a faint glow of lights ahead, a 24-hour gas station. We swerved into the station and rushed into the convenience store, urgently explaining the situation to the clerk, who immediately called the police. As we waited, the black SUV stopped at a distance. After a moment, the driver seemed to realize we were no longer vulnerable and turned around, speeding off into the darkness. When the police arrived, we explained everything, describing the strange man and his unsettling behavior. They searched the nearby roads but found no trace of the black SUV. The officer informed us that there had been a few reported cases of robberies targeting travelers in the area recently, and it seemed we had narrowly avoided falling into a trap. Though we had escaped danger, the experience left us shaken. We decided to end our trip early and head back home. As we drove, we reflected on what had happened. It was a sobering reminder of the risks that can come from trusting strangers in unfamiliar places, and how a simple act of kindness could easily turn into a dangerous mistake. On the way home, Kevin and I stayed alert, knowing full well that this adventure had been far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. We promised each other to be more cautious in the future and never to pick up strangers on the road again. Every light we saw along the way seemed warmer, a comfort that we hadn't noticed before. That's today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.